In February through May of 1965, the Beatles filmed their second full-length motion picture, this time in color, called Help. I think it was initially, the initial title for it was going to be called 8 Arms to Hold You, or something like this. Anyway, they ended up with the title Help. And again, it was directed by Richard Lester, who had done A Hard Day's Night, and was reportedly inspired by two sources, the Marx Brothers movie Duck Soup and the James Bond films, which were becoming popular during those years. James Bond, A License to Kill, Shaken Not Stirred, those spy movies were big. And so this is kind of a comedic take on the spy movie. Ringo's got a ring and some evil guys are trying to get it, and anyway. So all kinds of adventure ensues from that. You can tell that the Beatles are maybe not taking this movie as seriously, or they're starting to get maybe a little detached from commitment, I guess you might say, to the movie, because as Paul tells the story, you know, as they were sort of thinking, as they were sort of working through what the film was going to be with the people who were in charge of putting it together, they actually suggested locations purely out of personal interest. So, you know, I've never been to the Bahamas. Okay, great, let's film some in the Bahamas. You know, I've never actually been skiing in the Alps. Okay, well, let's have skiing in the Alps. And so they just sort of added this stuff in. Apparently, the Beatles really sorely tested Dick Lester's patience. I mean, they had a fantastic success with A Hard Day's Night, and Lester, of course, a film director on the rise, was eager to see that happen again. But the Beatles, as I said last week, and as I mentioned in the previous video, had a meeting with Bob Dylan at the end of August, beginning of September of 1964, where he had apparently introduced them to marijuana, which they had not had before. Beatles had done various drugs, mostly amphetamines, when they were in Hamburg and stuff, to keep them awake during the long hours they had to play. But they'd never had anything quite like the marijuana. And so, you know, the story is the Beatles, you know, Dylan and one of his friends sort of pull out the marijuana, and they start to smoke it up. And of course, you know, doing things like putting towels under the door jams to be sure that nothing gets, opening the windows, you know, this kind of thing, because the Beatles were aware that they were at that point teen idols. Anything that, you know, got out about them doing something like this would ruin their careers at that point, which of course wasn't the case in 1967-68. It actually kind of enhanced their careers, but in 1964 it would have been deadly. Well, they really liked the marijuana experience, and you have to understand that in a group like the Beatles, there's a lot of downtime. I mean, the Beatles were not the kind of people who would do a lot of writing when they were using drugs or under the influence of alcohol. And they were not the kind of people who would perform under the influence or even record under the influence all that much. But there's a lot of time being a Beatle, going from location to location, where you're just sort of sitting around in the hotel room. You can't go out and see the sights because you'll be mobbed by people. And so they had a lot of time on their hands to play cards and drink tea and apparently to smoke pot. And so this was one of the things they started doing an awful lot during the filming of Help. And if you listen to the stories of George Harrison and Ringo Starr and about this, they were pretty stoned most of the time. In fact, there's one scene in the film where they're in Buckingham Palace, and unlike a lot of the other scenes, this one required a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes worth of them exchanging lines and dialogue and this kind of thing. And apparently it took them all day to film this scene because they just couldn't stop giggling. And Richard Lester really was just sort of pushed to the end of his patience, at least according to George Harrison, about all of it. Now, this is at a time, 1965, when nobody was really thinking about drugs and rock music and all this kind of thing. And by the time people were starting to think about smoking pot, the Beatles had already moved on to other kinds of things. But as I mention this because there is going to be a kind of correlation between their use of marijuana and then LSD and various kinds of things like that, and the ways in which it, I think, opened them up creatively in interesting kinds of ways. Now, none of what I'm saying should be perceived as a kind of endorsement of drug use or any kind of thing like that. And for, for young people who are watching these videos, I'm not saying you should go out and smoke dope so you can write songs like Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney would have written great songs whether he'd ever smoked dope or done LSD or not. But the fact is it does play a role, and it's interesting that it plays a role much earlier than it does in popular culture at the time. So anyway, some way, somehow, Help got filmed and finished and premiered in August of 1965. John Lennon was not too happy about the film, and he thought that Richard Lester really had sort of lost sight of who the Beatles were and sort of put them in a film that really didn't suit them. And the famous quote is that he says that Lester forgot about who and what we were. It was like having clams in a movie about frogs. I think kind of to translate Johnny's here, it might be something like, it's like having, pop musicians in a spy movie. And that's essentially what Help did. But the fans did not care. This is all critical stuff from inside the Beatles camp and stuff that we look back on. At the time, Help was another blockbuster movie for the Beatles. And if anything could, it seemed crazy that they could get any bigger than they'd been in 1964 with A Hard Day's Night. But here, come along in the summer of 1965, and it seemed like that's exactly what was happening. So let's turn now to the music and talk a bit more about how the Beatles' music really began to change during this year as they began to sort of transform themselves from craftsmen into something more like artists.